demonstrations. So while we organize, let us speak out in those unique ways we have at our disposal. And if I could use just one summation to say what we do, I would like to recount a cartoon I just recently saw in a popular men's magazine, and I'm going to have to clean up the language a little bit on it, but it's I think very relevant to what we've just been saying here. It's a picture of a knave and a king, and they're standing in this turret of this castle, and there's rocks and arrows and everything being thrown up at them. And the knave turns to the king and he says, "I agree, sire, but when 10,000 jackasses speak as one, even the king should heed their call." Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Our next panelist is Art Thompson, who's a native to Cass County, Iowa, born here in 1906. He graduated from, which was Iowa State College here in Ames, in 1928 in journalism, and worked in several smaller Iowa newspapers until spring of 1930 when he began working at Wallace's Farmer. By the fall of 1932, Wallace's Farmer fell in the same hard times that most of the farm communities were, and he spent the winter picking corn out of fields until spring of 1933 when he went off to Washington for his first trip, working in the information services connected with the being organized at that time Agriculture Adjustment Administration. Came back to Wallace's Farmer in 1935 until 1942 as assistant editor, and then went back to Washington again, this time to work in the livestock department of the Office of Foreign Agricultural Relations. Worked in that department of the government, went overseas to Argentina as a foreign agriculture attaché, back to the farm in 1949, where he stayed until 1955. In 1955, he went back to Wallace's Farmer for the third time as editor, but only stayed 2 years. It was sold in 1957, and he left at that time. Went back to Washington again for his third trip, where he became the editor of the National Farmers Union Washington Bulletin, a weekly publication still coming out now. Was called back to Iowa in 59 to assist the governor, Governor Lovelace at that time, with agricultural issues. Went back to Washington in 1961 with the grain division of the USDA. There was a lot of changes in farm policy at that time he was actively involved in. In 1968, he retired and came back to Iowa, settled in West Des Moines, and he's been the editor since of the Iowa Union Farmer, the official publication of the Iowa Farmers Union here in Iowa. Welcome you, Art Thompson.
I'm glad the reading of that obituary cleared me up as far as the Farm Press of today is concerned, because I got fired in 1957. I take this up in the Farm Press activity, and I can best discuss the Wallace's Farmer role after World War I until the magazine was sold, as I've just said, in 1957. The Wallace's Farmer is a good deal more than a passive journal, reporting from the sidelines mainly on how to do it aspects of farming. There were more than that. It had broad aims as indicated by its front page motto, good farming, clear thinking, right living. But it was most outstanding for its wide-ranging, thoughtful editorials on unimportant issues of the day, and I learned that best when I was going to school here at Ames. The concern of this magazine was greatly intensified beginning in 1919. It was in 1919, with farmers still under the spell of high wartime prices, that we had a feverish land boom get underway. I can remember yet how one of our local bankers excited the prospective buyers of some of my neighbors by saying, "Keep it in mind that there's only so much of this good land left." I was just entering high school and I did not sense the danger in such a boom price, but Henry Wallace did. And so on January 31st, 1919 issue of the paper, Henry A. Wallace, in a lead article entitled Farm Depression in England Following the Napoleonic War, said near the close in this paragraph, "We review thus briefly the conditions which followed the Napoleonic War for the double purpose of putting our readers on guard against assuming for the present agricultural prices are likely to continue, and to suggest to them the need for their taking an active part to safeguard their own interests as far as possible. Henry Wallace was a far-seeing economist as well as a practical geneticist. A little later that year, he began what proved to be a series of statements of the same thing over the 20s, and that was, batten your hatches, pay off your debts. Since a real smash-up, he said, is inevitable. And of course, that smash-up came 2 years later. This is the Depression of the 20s, which some people have almost forgotten about. But strangely, there wasn't any march of distressed farmers at that time. Those ruined by the land boom were made to feel it was their own fault. And others were able to pull in their belts because their investment then in horsepower and simple machinery was low. And we all had milk cows, and we had chickens for eggs and meat. On the editorial page, in the early 1920, under the heading Less Corn, Less Labor, More Money, Wallace advised farmers to think seriously about cutting production. In another editorial, it was proposed that a year-to-year reserve should be stored from the current grain surplus. That's a familiar piece of advice, began then. And since, however, there was yet no device for ensuring acreage cut benefits to complying farmers, Wallace's suggestions, while fundamentally sensible, and due eventually to have their day, went unheeded in 1921 and again in 1922. Undaunted, though, the magazine, with its 2 full pages of editorials each week, went on helping farmers to understand the economics of the difficult time through which they were living. And by this time, we're either of 1925, after the election, Henry C. Wallace, the father, I'm an error on that time, is 21. The father was off to Washington as Secretary of Agriculture in Harding's cabinet, and both Wallaces, Henry C. as his cabinet post and H.A. out here, began calling for a farm group support of a new idea to restore farm purchasing power by moving the excess over domestic requirements into export at whatever price could be obtained. This adjustment of supply available to the domestic market was expected to result in a more acceptable 2-part return to farmers, even if they stood part of the program's cost, which in its various phases was sometimes included. Several influential coalitions of farm leaders did get behind the export surplus disposal idea, and it took form in the congressional legislation as the McNary-Haugen Plan, which some of you older people in the audience will remember. And although objecting to some weakening amendments at times, Wallace's farmer supported the plan editorially through its 2 enactments, but to no avail. President Coolidge killed it first in 1927, and finally in 1928 with a stinging veto message which Samos told farmers to go home and slop their hogs. Under the Hoover administration that followed, a $500 million attempt was made to stabilize farm prices by more orderly marketing, chiefly through cooperatives, and then there was a sort of an affiliate set up that was built just for the purpose at the time called stabilization corporations. The effort failed from a combination of no control over acreage and a deepening worldwide depression. What the Wallace editors had rather gloomily predicted came to pass. Many farmers who managed to survive the land boom aftermath of the 1920-1922 struggled on through the rest of the 20s, only to lose out anyway in the terrible depression in the early 30s. Grim-faced, they were among those who finally stopped chattel mortgage liquidations and turned back milk and livestock trucks from reaching markets. And as a reporter, I was in close to a lot of that. All these protest activities were noted understandingly by Wallace's farmer, but he recognized that crying calamity was no solution, that only federal intervention under changes in national policy could deal with the powerful forces